Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will take us into a legal area, something that we haven't spent too much time on here on the podcast, but we are going to be guided by Benjamin Straumann as we unpack the concept of whether Rome, the state of Rome that is, had a constitution. Even though it was not written, was there a Roman constitution? And if so, how should we think of that concept? What did it mean? And if there was a constitution, were there also constitutional crises? We recorded this back in February, I believe, but it seems like the topic is very relevant now. Dr. Benjamin Straumann, how are you, sir?
Very well, thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it, and I'm glad we could set this up. As everybody who listens knows, I like to give first-time guests a chance to tell the audience how they got into the field that we call the classics, and also how you ended up studying the legal history of both Greece and Rome.
Yeah, so I had, when I was in high school, the kind of high school here in German-speaking countries in Switzerland that is called Gymnasium. You tend to have at least Latin in high school. And I positively hated it, and I wasn't particularly good at it. And so, but I was interested in history. And so when I went to university as an undergrad, I thought I would do modern history, perhaps early modern, something like that. But then I spent a bit over a year in Rome as an exchange student and got sucked into classical antiquity. And that provided me with a new kind of motivation to brush up my Latin and also in addition learn Greek. And so that converted me from a modern historian to a classicist. And then the legal history part is interesting in that I was, as a teenager or so, probably like the typical left-wing teenager who was I was very interested in Marxism, and I read a lot of Marxist literature, and so I thought I would study history and economics, being a hardcore determinist materialist back then. But when I started studying history, I started thinking that actually the law and the ideas behind the law are, as a matter of empirical historical fact, far more important, or at least as important, depending on when and where you look, and at least as important as economics is. So after a year or two, I stopped economics and did more law and legal history on the side. And so this is how this somewhat idiosyncratic combination came about.
So where are you currently, and if you're doing any teaching, what are you teaching?
I'm currently a professor at the University of Zurich in Switzerland in the Department of History here. And so I teach a lot of ancient history stuff, but also the reception of the classics. So how classical historiography and classical philosophy were being put to use in early modern Europe up to and including 18th century, the Enlightenment.
So do you ever delve into kind of the modern co-opting of the classics by they call it white nationalism, white supremacists, kind of is the same term. So do you ever get into any of that in your teaching? It's becoming sadly more relevant today.
Yeah, no, I have not. I'm of course also I read the newspaper, and everything that's to do with the classics is great interest to me. So I have this been quite puzzled about this phenomenon, and in general the use of the interest that the classics seem to hold for this kind of far right movement. But I have not really taken this up in teaching or at the university, not least because I think it's far more of a US phenomenon than here. It hasn't really, in these US cultural things tend to become relevant here very quickly. So I expect this to be a thing here too very soon. But so far, I haven't really noticed that here. It's more my kind of consumption of American media that has made me aware of the phenomenon.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of nod and dog whistle that goes on where I'm not going to name names, but the audience can figure this out, where a cabinet secretary, people were being told to support him because he would, a nominee would classically educate his kids, which I thought was really, really strange to
That is
see that.
odd, yeah.
Yeah,
I can't be against that person on these grounds. I'm sure there's many others, but
there's no shortage for this guy. Yeah, but
yeah,
it's
I happen to not know who you mean, so I don't know. But yeah, this in particular would be a net positive to my mind. But it is definitely an interesting. That is an interesting. I wasn't aware of this.
Yeah, well, we'll we'll put a pin in that one for now. But let's we've talked a little bit about your interest in the law and kind of the roots behind the law, which as I was reading the materials that you sent me in the article of yours that I found, Constitutional Thought in the Late Roman Republic, has had me thinking about what law is, what it means. So let's get into the concept of Roman constitutionalism and during the Republic, whether we can say Rome did have a constitution, and if so, how we would broadly define the term constitution in the context of the Roman Republic.
Yeah, so that this is actually it's as interesting as it is hotly contested because as I'm sure you're aware and your listeners as well, in the scholarly literature about the Roman Republic, there is a faction of scholars who tend to refer to the Roman Republic Constitution with scare quotes. So there was no such thing. It's just the Constitution. And then there's a faction that takes it seriously and thinks, no, there was a kind of constitutional order, even in a kind of juridical sense. And so there's a lot of arguments on both sides that have some merit. Without getting into the weeds, but there's a bit of a let's say that the background to this debate has been set up by a guy called Theodor Mommsen in the 19th century, a German scholar and legal historian who wrote a book, really several volumes, a massive treatise on römisches Staatsrecht, so Roman constitutional law, Roman public law, the law of the state. And he took it seriously. He thought there was a kind of constitutional order quite clearly. But that has fallen into not quite disrepute, but it's not fashionable anymore to think in those terms. So these days, there's a lot of scholars who think really there was no such thing. That was a 19th century misinterpretation of the source material. But the interesting thing is that actually even those scholars have a hard time usually making sense of the evidence without assuming at least a kind of implicit or inchoate concept of constitution operating in the background. So I think that there are good grounds for thinking in these juridical terms, not least because the Romans themselves are thinking constantly in these juridical terms. So if you think, current United States is a litigious and lawyerly culture, then you will find the ancient Romans particularly congenial because they are as litigious as present-day Americans, and they're also as prone to seeing political phenomena in juridical terms. So it is, I think, very hard to read through the evidence and not come away with the idea that these people had a sense that there was a constitution, not just a constitution in a sociological sense, just an order that happens to be there, but actually a normative constitution that was expressed and could be expressed in legal terms. So I think on balance, Mommsen and these days other scholars such as Andrew Lintott, who wrote a book about the constitution of the Roman Republic without scare quotes, I think they have it right. And the Romans themselves thought they had something like a higher order constitutional law that governed their state.
So essentially, what the Roman Republic had, in contrast with the Republic in the United States and most democratic governments today, there was not a written document of this is our Constitution, this is Articles 1 through 4. Instead, there was just a series of understood and enforced practices that gave rise to what you and the other scholars refer to as a constitutional order.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. So it is important, as you point out, to keep in mind that when we're talking about the Constitution of the Roman Republic, there is not some, we can't go to the bookshelf here and take it out and say, look, here it is, like these booklets that you get, the US Constitution, that kind of thing. There's no such thing. So that is very true. And that's also one of the arguments that's been made in favor of the view that the Romans didn't really have a constitution. But I think that's a very anachronistic way of looking at it, because if you look at, 18th century authors, the people who actually came up with the American Constitution, and they're the people who influenced the founders and framers most, they were all pretty impressed both with the Roman Republic and with the English 18th century British Constitution. And of course, neither the Brits didn't have a constitutional booklet. They didn't have that either. So that didn't prevent anyone from talking of the Constitution, the British Constitution. So it is a view, if the criterion for having constitution is having a written constitution, then that is a very, to the classicists' mind, a very anachronistic and very recent criterion for having a constitution. But it's true, if that's your main criterion, then of course the Romans did not have that kind of thing.
Well, as I've listened to you describe it, and as I read the materials for today, it reminded me of what we have in the United States, which is in most states, you have what's called a common law system, meaning judge-made, experienced, developed law that does provide norms and societal orders for things. And that's what it sounded like here, although it wasn't just the legal system, it was the manner in which the Senate and the consuls and the elected officials carried out their business, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so there is, on the one hand, you have, say, private law, kind of litigation that happens, citizens among each other, law of contract, torts, all these things, property disputes, all that stuff is being handled by a praetor, and then the praetor gives some kind of remedy, and it's the Romans think in very procedural ways. They don't think someone has a claim because there's a right, but they rather think someone has a right because they have an actual legal remedy, an actio. So they think along those procedural lines in private law, and these people, the praetor and then the judge, two different people, they tend to be lay people. They are not lawyers themselves, but they have increasingly from the 2nd century BCE onwards, they have lawyers to go to because stuff gets more complicated. And so the praetor builds up an edict in which every year the new praetor says, these are the legal remedies that I'm willing to grant. And in formulating this edict, he's being counseled by lawyers, and this becomes increasingly technical. And so in that way, it's not the praetor himself or the iudex, the actual judge, who determines the matter, who are lawyers who are issuing these rules or creating the rules, but it's the people who, in the background, counsel them. And that's the private law part. But then at the same time, this whole thing operates in the framework of a political order or constitutional order, as I would say. How is this defined? Who is the praetor in the first place? Who gets to call himself that? And so who makes the rules that the praetor only is there for 1 year and not for 2 years? How many praetors are there? All these rules belong to public law, and the Romans had a conception of public law. They differentiated between private and public law. And so there is the sense that the state itself and its institutions, so the Senate, the popular assemblies, the magistrates, all of this is defined in a very legalistic way. And so these rules belong to public law, I would say largely to constitutional law. This constitutional law is sometimes written, sometimes it's part of statute, sometimes it's just known, so it's unwritten. Sometimes it's being positivized, but has after having been used already in a statute. But it is increasingly clear, I think, when you read through the evidence, that people such as Cicero, who operate in these forensic contexts, they think of these rules that govern, what is the Senate, what are the assemblies, what are the magistrates, and so forth. They think of these public law rules as a kind of higher order rule, as a kind of higher order constitutional rule. And so that is what makes me think that we have actually to ascribe a concept of constitution to the Romans of the late Republic.
So when would you say that the Constitution, or at least the conceptual framework of the Constitution, came into being, and then how long did it endure for?
That's an excellent question. So I would say, we find so the evidence that people thought of the state in these juridical terms is already, I think we already see that some indirectly maybe taking a hold in the I would say late 2nd century BCE. And then it becomes really salient and relevant in the crisis of the Roman Republic. So as this order is collapsing, people realize that whenever they try to make an argument based on these higher order rules, they realize precisely that there is no, body of rules, a text, a written constitution that they could say, look, this is what actually the Constitution is. But so they're left with making these kind of arguments based on this implicit constitutional order. And so I think it's really the crisis of the late Republic of the last century BCE that brings out the need for having a constitutional order. And so that's when we see these arguments being made increasingly. And you could even say with little exaggeration that most of the conflicts that we see in the last century of the Roman Republic are actually at least framed in constitutional terms.
So you've talked about positive law, meaning law that's enacted by the Senate, and you've talked about the legal system, and we've gotten into some of the elected positions that kind of make law or rules or order. You also talk about in your articles oaths, and I'm just curious what kind of role oaths played in this. Were they treated any different from laws? The example that you gave is Brutus making all the people take an oath that they would suffer no one to be a king in Rome. How important, if we have any understanding of that, were oaths to this constitutional order?
Well, so this particular oath that Brutus has the Roman population swear according to Livy is something that Livy is a guy who lives at the early Principate, so early time of Emperor Augustus. The Roman Republic is basically gone, but Livy still knew the Republic. And so when he writes this history of Rome ever since its founding, he really doesn't know what's happening in the 5th century BCE, but we think today he projects a lot of the conflicts of the late Roman Republic back. So a lot of the conflicts of the 1st century BCE are being projected back into the 5th century BCE as Livy develops his history. And so this story of this oath that Brutus is swearing, I think, is largely influenced by events of the 1st century BCE. We don't really have independent evidence that this oath or any other oath would really play a key role in the constitutional life of the Republic. I think it's rather that Livy writing about the way the republic came about after the rule of the kings, and then you have these 10 men who are charged with coming up with new rules. He saw the necessity of coming up to explaining why he thought there was a rule in Rome that we cannot have kings. And so he had to somehow explain how this came about. And so he uses this, actually, it's, this kind of private law device of an oath to show that this rule, that the Romans really didn't want kings anymore, had a kind of elated higher order constitutional status. But apart from this story by Livy, this one and maybe a couple others, there is no really good evidence that this really actually happened, and that oaths really had this kind of status in public law.
One thing I meant to ask you earlier, and I want to come back to it before we go to our next topic, is for the people who say that there's no Roman constitution, or they use quotes to refer to it, how do they respond to Julius Caesar and Sulla cloaking themselves and reestablishing an order and using clearly recognized positions, the dictator, to justify their actions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on which scholar you have in mind, but usually the view there is one of this is just so much rhetoric. These guys, this is just power politics that is cloaking itself in the language of law, and we have to be clear-headed enough to see through this. This is usually the argument that's being made, but it is really hard to reconcile the insistence, also the importance that this kind of language seems to have for the protagonists of the conflicts of the late Republic, to reconcile this importance with it being mere rhetoric. It's unclear. Also, one should say, that this rhetoric it plays a role, as I said earlier, in forensic context. So a lot actually rides on it. So when you could convince a jury in one of these jury courts that Cicero is often found addressing, if you could convince a jury that someone had acted perhaps according to statute, but in violation of the underlying higher order law, if someone had acted perhaps lege, according to statute, but not jure, not really according to the constitutional order, then you could, you could win your case. So it is hard to argue that this stuff was ineffectual. So sometimes it was ineffectual, sometimes it's really just power politics, but sometimes it is effectual. So I think depending on the case, one has to agree that this is more than just rhetoric.
Well, and I guess, and this is going to be a butchered example, but let's just say that you came into the, let's say you were a politician and came into the United States and all you spoke was French. Almost no one would understand you, right? And you wouldn't be able to accomplish whatever your goal is. You wouldn't be able to develop a winning coalition. But if you spoke English and you could use the terminology, you would have a chance of succeeding. And I kind of think about that in the context of what Sulla and Caesar were doing, which is, while it may be that they were violating the norms or violating the rules themselves, they were nonetheless speaking in a language and in a manner and acting in a manner that the Roman state and the Roman people could understand, which would imply and give credence to the position that there was, sort of like in business. I always think of the business or sports culture are the rules that aren't written down. It's the things you don't see. It's just what's expected. That seems to be what would have to be at play here, right? That there is some understanding of the way things are supposed to work, hence why these dictators are communicating in that manner.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's a good example. Actually, I think that's I think that illustrates it very well. So you have even, sometimes, so Sulla tries to get to this position where he has the power to even write new legislation, that kind of thing, as a dictator, which is completely unheard of. But then when you look at what he actually does, it seems that he thinks he can't really get away with that after all, for all the power that he has amassed and for the clearly semi-monarchical position that he has achieved, at least for a few years. And so he actually takes great pains to push all his legislation through the comitia, through the assemblies, rubber stamp it, you might say, but it's even a bit more than mere lip service to these constitutional arguments. And then on the other hand, later you find people like Cicero, who's actually probably has a lot of sympathy for the Sullan program, the constitutional reordering that Sulla tried to achieve. When it comes to the content of it, Cicero has probably a lot of sympathy for it. But the way Sulla went about this is being mercilessly criticized by Cicero on constitutional grounds. I mean, he always points out that Sulla's the way he went about things was entirely and deeply unconstitutional.
Well, let's talk about, we've used the term constitutional crisis, and we've talked about that a little bit with how the Republic collapsed, and you've written a book about that. So I'd like to get into that topic about the collapse of the Republic being a constitutional crisis itself. How should we define that term? Because in the United States, it gets used a lot. And generally, I think people use that term in most instances here when something that they really don't like happens and there's a conflict between two branches of government. But I'm not sure that quite encapsulates what a true crisis is. So how should we define this term to begin with?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think also from my just kind of anecdotal evidence of the way that the term is being thrown around in the US these days, it seems it's a bit used in a bit inflationary way. I would say in the Roman case, it's really about two mutually exclusive interpretations of the constitutional order, and there is neither a institutional solution to this, because the constitutional order, and here the scare quotes faction, the people who think there wasn't really a constitution, they have a point that it's an implicit constitutional order. So it's more like the British order in the 18th century than the American one. And so there is a kind of a lack of, one might call it institutional closure. So who gets to ultimately decide? That's one thing. And the other thing is there's also a lack of a clear-cut way of bridging these mutually exclusive interpretations of the constitutional order. So I would say it's really when in 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus, who's a tribune of the people, then he tries to push through agrarian legislation, push it through the popular assembly, and a fellow tribune, Marcus Octavius, vetoes this. And so this kind of veto is unremarkable, happens all the time. Magistrates who are on the same level can usually block their colleagues from achieving anything if they veto it, if they veto what they're doing. And so Octavius does this, but then Tiberius Gracchus resorts to quite a radical argument, namely saying, look, the people would like to vote for this on this proposal, and if you veto my putting this to the people, then you're in fact you have ceased to be a proper tribune of the people, which means we can simply depose you. Now that is a radical and a completely novel argument at this point, but the comitia, the assembly, proceeds to actually doing just that. And if you then look at the evidence, ever since 133 BCE, no one really cares about the agrarian legislation that Tiberius tried to get through the assemblies, and which is why Octavius put in the veto. Everyone cares about the fact that Octavius was simply deposed by the assembly. Everyone thought that is really the beginning of a new interpretation of the Roman constitutional order, and it was one that was henceforth quite successful, and it could not be reconciled with the other interpretation, which would have said that deposing someone because of a rightful veto is simply not possible, regardless of the substance of the proposal. So this kind of thing, I think, illustrates a real constitutional crisis, and it was really one with reverberations up to the end of the Republic.
So here in the States, and it may be hard to kind of project this back 2,000 plus years, I viewed a crisis, a constitutional crisis, as an enforcement problem. Namely, you have a set of rules or an order or a way things are done, and you have a branch of government or some part of your governmental organization that's supposed to enforce these norms. And then either the system is too weak to enforce those rules, or you have John Roberts becoming complicit in destroying, to a large degree, a key element of our order in his immunity decision that he wrote. And I shouldn't necessarily personalize it to him, but he wrote the opinion, and he was kind of the gunslinger in taking that case up. And we could talk for a long time about how that opinion from the court will legalize corruption at the highest level in the United States, and there's not really a whole lot that can be done about it. So that's how I think about it here, and it seems like there is some sort of an element to that at play as the Republic starts to collapse. Namely, we have order and we have rules, but either people aren't following them, or there's a desire to change them, or, with Caesar, as soon as he gives up his army, he's going to get tried for his massive corruption. And he doesn't want to do that. And there's not an effective counter to his power. I mean, how should we kind of contextualize the elements or parts of the crisis that came to take the Republic apart? Was it an enforcement problem? Was it there was just a desire to do things differently? Was it all these things combined, and probably 4 or 5 other things I haven't mentioned?
Well, I mean, I think here we have to step back and look beyond merely the constitutional aspects. I mean, I think the constitutional aspects, I would be the first to say that they're of central importance, but there's other stuff that's happening that is also important. And so in the case of the Roman Republic, there is really, one might say, due to the extraordinary expansion of the Republic, all over imperial expansion, all over the Mediterranean, there is increasingly a sense that there are challenges, military challenges, real ones or made up ones, that can only be met by extraordinary powers. And these extraordinary powers don't fit into the Constitution as hitherto conceived. And so there's now a huge incentive of, claiming that you need these powers, whether you need them or not. But it's clear that even if, in cases where there is clearly a necessity for that kind of thing, there is no real way of developing the rules, the constitutional rules themselves in a kind of rule-governed way. So there's no Article 5 of the Roman Republican Constitution that would govern how to amend the order. And so this, I think, this kind of the imperial expansion and the possibilities it creates for these warlords of the late Republic to have to gain extraordinary riches in these theaters of war that are the provinces, and then to pay off their troops, have troops that are centrifugal in the sense that they're now becoming more loyal to their commanders than to the Roman Republic itself. All of these factors combined with the fact that the constitutional order itself is not really explicit and is not really amenable to an explicit way of changing it. All this conspires, I think, to these centrifugal tendencies that rip the republic apart.
So, in the key constitutional elements, you mentioned that were at play and were at central. What was central to this collapse? What would you boil those down to? What would you say these are the main constitutional portions of what we see as the crisis that develops and is part of the collapse of the republic itself?
Yeah, that's the key question, right? So that's what everybody would like to know, of course, and it is fascinating because it's the question that is behind all the early modern constitution making efforts, especially of republican orders, up to and very much including the American Republic in the late 18th century. So the question is always, if we're trying to build this large republic, has there ever been anything like it? Not really. I mean, why would you want to build a republican order, given that republics in antiquity tended to be small and short-lived? Well, the answer is there was one that was not short-lived and that was not small, and the Roman Republic. But then the counter as well. But then you have the collapse of this thing eventually, right? And so, what were the causes of the collapse, and how could this be remedied? And this is a question that fascinates everyone from Jean Baudin in the 16th century in France to the American founders in the late 18th century. And so I think these early modern thinkers knew the ancient evidence quite well. And what they usually do is they go back to Cicero's diagnosis of the problem and also his attempts at remedying the problem. And one issue is what I mentioned earlier, is that simply, you have this implicit inchoate constitution that everyone fights over, but making it explicit and giving it explicitly a kind of written and elated, more entrenched status, that is one of the remedies that Cicero seems to have in mind. I mean, he writes a treatise De Legibus on the laws, where he puts forward an order for a state as the republic is already crumbling around him in the last years of the republic. And he seems to think, well, if only we made these rules more explicit, and if we found ways of actually, as you say, enforcing these hitherto implicit, now explicit rules, that would be a great step forward in either saving this republic or helping other republican orders to survive. And so this is something I think in early modern Europe and then in the US is being, newly independent US is being taken up and feeds into this constitution making, this new enthusiasm for constitution making. I think the analysis that is underlying it is one that sees that, enforcement is of course important, but it always raises the question, if the enforcing institution itself is the problem, then what do you do? And there is a very influential strand of thought already in classical antiquity. It starts really, I think, with the Greek historian Polybius in the 2nd century BCE, who analyzes the Roman Republic, and he analyzes it in very seemingly modern terms of a equilibrium. He thinks the Roman Republic is in equilibrium, and as long as you can have this kind of balance, the enforcement is in a way happening due to this equilibrium. So it's not that every institutional part of the order, one part has enforcement power. It's that they all have equal weight and therefore balance each other out. And that is really the beginning of this checks and balances thought. And Cicero takes this up. He thinks he can give this a more formal and more explicitly legal expression. And so the solution to the problem is usually sought in a kind of constitutional balance. Now, that means that the analysis of the late Republic is that the balance is out of whack. And usually this is how, from Jean Bodin onwards, analysts have actually diagnosed the problem. They thought one part of the constitution was getting too strong for the others to still balance it out. And that had led to the collapse of the Republic. The problem is, in a way, as you alluded to, in any kind of constitutional order that is based on this checks and balances idea, you do have the issue. You have an enforcement issue. You mentioned Justice Roberts, the Supreme Court. I think these days doesn't need an army to enforce its judgments, but in the 19th century, for example, I think there's examples under Jackson where you have the court pronouncing on something and the executive branch simply not paying all that much attention. So I think that it is simply a problem that beyond this equilibrium idea, I think we haven't made huge progress.
Right. And there have been a number of disputes and debates about the role of the court in the United States and how it is balancing and checking everything out. And as a young teenager who got very interested in John Marshall and read a lot about John Marshall, and well, I shouldn't say young teenager. I was probably 16 or so, and through college I read a bunch of Marshall stuff. I always was big on the John Marshall side, but now of late, I don't know what has happened to me, but I am almost becoming a Jacksonian in my views about the role of the court. And I was texting one of my history professors, and I said, I don't know what has happened in my life now. But it is kind of weird how now we just can let 5 people in Washington, D.C. here just decide something called the major questions doctrine in administrative law and constitutional law that I never heard about in my entire legal career until that day that they created it. And that's the final word, basically, practically speaking, constitutionally, but whatever. So you talked about how the Roman system got out of whack as far as the balance. It was off, the equilibrium was lost. And that kind of segues into kind of what you had talked about with the expansion of the state into the Mediterranean, across through Spain, up towards Britain, into North Africa, and it made the military kind of the key part of all this. And so then Rome sort of has its soldiers as the power base, and it kind of devolves into a military dictatorship for a long time, right?
Yeah, you mean at the end of the Republic?
Yeah, and that essentially continued in through the imperial state, because if you didn't have the backing of the soldiers, you could be gone pretty quick.
Yeah, I think this kind of one might call it a kind of warlord model. So these these commanders who secure for themselves multi-year commands in some faraway theater of war in the late Republic, they do become a kind of model for the later, imperial, the Principate, the kind of monarchy that Augustus erects on the ruins of the Roman Republic. But it's a monarchy that is still really the terminology that this monarchy uses is still an entirely Republican one. So it's a kind of it's a monarchy disguised as a republic. And so, you could say that it is the prominence of the troops, these emperors, which they still, stand. They still are consuls year after year. They have certain prerogatives that are all defined in Republican terms, but they're so expanded beyond their Republican constraints and bounds that it is in a way laughable. But they still adhere to what is now really just rhetoric. But it is true, as a matter of fact, then the Senate and first the committee has stopped working, the popular assemblies, and then eventually the Senate as well. It just doesn't do much. It doesn't have any kind of independent agency anymore, and this really becomes then the emperors become dependent on acclamation by the military to secure their position, because in a way, who becomes the next emperor? That is the succession issue is a problem in a monarchy that does not dare speak its name. It's formally still a republic, so we can't have an explicit dynasty or anything. So you have kind of this inbuilt succession, this Achilles heel, which is succession. And there, I think you're right to say that really it is increasingly the troops that fill the role of designating an heir, especially in contested cases.
Well, it was interesting what you said about Augustus using Republican terminology, because even the term princeps was an old Republic term, right, for the guy
Mm-hmm.
who'd been in the Senate the longest or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's well,
Yeah,
he was a master at that. Augustus was very effective at his political message projecting.
yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I mean, one should probably also say that all the while, it is true. It becomes basically a kind of military monarchy. The republic tilts into this kind of one-man rule. On the other hand, this juridical culture, in a way, continues. So it expresses itself in this rhetorical lip service to Republican legal terminology in public law. But that's one part. But on the other hand, there is also these emperors. They build up increasingly, as opposed to the Republic, which didn't really have this. They build up a kind of administrative apparatus, a kind of bureaucracy, and these bureaucrats, they're more and more lawyers. It's a kind of it has many more of the trappings of a kind of a state than the Republic had. And so, although at the top, if you're part of the senatorial order and you say the wrong stuff, then this is a very nasty system. But if you're a Roman citizen in some faraway republic, or even just a provincial in some faraway republic, not even a Roman citizen, then it might be that this is actually a system with far more rule of law, or at least legal order, stability, the possibility to put forward press claims, legal claims, than the Republic ever was. So there is a kind of continuity of this juridical mindset, but it operates now at a different level. On the one hand, private law, Roman law continues. All the stuff we have in the digest, the monument to Roman jurisprudence. That's all mostly from the imperial period, from the Principate. And so you could say that at least in private law, and at least in that domain, not the Republican order, not the constitutional order, which is now really an autocracy, but private law stuff, that all there, the continuity is quite striking.
Well, to wrap this up here, we've covered a lot. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on now. You've written a book previously, which I'll link in the show notes, Crisis and Constitutionalism, Roman Political Thought from the Fall of the Republic to the Age of Revolution. What else do you have in the work at the moment?
So I've just finished a book on Greek and Roman theories of justice and their legacy in Western thought. So there's it's a kind of a survey, but it's a survey that puts forward a point of view. It's called The Just State, and it's just out this month. I haven't had a physical copy yet, but I've been assured that's in the mail by the publishers. It's just come out by Wiley Blackwell. It's called The Just State, Greek and Roman Theories of Justice and Their Legacy in Western Thought. So that quite relieved to be done with this. And then I have a couple of smaller projects, papers, organizing a conference this year about the influence of these kind of Ciceronian ideas of the constitutional state on early modern constitution making. But these are the biggest things that I can think of top of my head.
Well, give us a good book to read. It can be any book from any time period about any subject matter.
Well, because we've been talking now at great length about this issue, I think there is actually maybe two things. One is really if one is interested in how this Roman Republican order looked like. In detail, but still in a accessible manner, then I think Andrew Lintott's The Constitution of the Roman Republic, that's OUP, Oxford University Press, 1999, I think, or something like that. That is really still an excellent survey of just the key institutions, how they work, how they fit together, all of that. And then another book that I always thought was extremely stimulating, not so well known, is a book by a important ancient historian, the late Fergus Miller, Millar, and I think that is called The Roman Republic in European Thought or something like that. And that's really about the way, on the one hand, he sees the Roman Republic as almost a democracy, which is a pretty idiosyncratic view. Most people do not agree with this. But then he talks about how just the example of the Roman Republic, also up to at least the 18th century, how important it was for people trying to design new institutions. So these two I would recommend.
And what would be a good future podcast episode? I'm not promising it will happen, but I will try.
I think it would be interesting to have something on the state of Augustus. Maybe a specialist on the Principate, talking about how this state. To what extent is this really just rhetoric that Augustus restores the Republic? So to what extent is this just a smokescreen? To what extent is actually something there? I mean, it is not just some sort of, at least not immediately, just straightforward autocracy. So the rhetoric still has kind of an effect. And so someone who specializes in the political system of the Principate, I think, would be quite a good person to have on.
Well, Dr. Straumann, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking time to appear on the podcast with me and discuss this, what I find a very interesting and very, again, relevant topic. Now, if you want to stay in touch with the podcast, go to the website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Check out the socials, either at DukeFB Coverage or at Antiquity Pod. Hey, why don't you give us a call, 540-632-0160, leave a message, and you'll get in an episode. Thanks to Brent Arehart, who put this wonderful theme music together. And stay tuned, folks. More episodes are coming because, as you know, Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.